A simple woman was told she couldn't change a tire. The mechanic laughed, the manager smirked, and the waiting room went silent with secondhand embarrassment. Then she knelt down. And what happened in the next 90 seconds made the entire shop go quiet. Sometimes the people we underestimate carry stories that could humble us all. And on a cold Tuesday morning at Martinez Auto Center, everyone was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The fluorescent lights of Martinez Auto Center hummed overhead, casting harsh white light across the oil-stained concrete floor. Elena Reyes pushed through the glass door at 7:43 a.m. Her worn canvas jacket zipped to her chin against the November chill. She carried no purse, just a small backpack, slung over one shoulder, faded and patched in two places, with duct tape that had long since lost its stickiness. At 52, Elena had grown comfortable with invisibility. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her jeans were clean but frayed at the hems. Her sneakers, once white, had faded to a tired beige that matched the color of forgotten things. She approached the service counter, where a young man in his mid-20s sat scrolling through his phone. His name tag read Marcus, and his pressed uniform shirt looked freshly laundered, creased at the sleeves with military precision. He didn't look up when she arrived. Elena waited patiently, her hands folded in front of her, her breathing steady and unhurried. Around the waiting area, 3 other customers sat in plastic chairs. A businessman in a tailored suit typed furiously on his laptop. A woman in yoga attire sipped from a stainless steel water bottle. An older gentleman read a newspaper, the pages crackling with each turn. None of them looked at Elena. She was background, unremarkable, easy to overlook. After 30 seconds, Marcus glanced up, his expression moving quickly from blank to mildly annoyed. "Yeah," he said. Not quite a question, not quite a greeting. "I'm here about the tire rotation and brake check," Elena said softly. Her voice carried no edge, no demand, just a statement of purpose. Marcus tapped his screen, then reached for a clipboard hanging on the wall behind him. Name? Reyes. Elena Reyes. He scanned the list, his finger trailing down the page. Finally, he found it, and made a checkmark with exaggerated force. The pen left an indent in the paper. "You're the walk-in from yesterday?" She nodded. "Yeah, okay. We're pretty backed up this morning. It's gonna be at least 3 hours. Maybe 4. 3 is fine," Elena replied. Marcus set the clipboard down and slid a set of keys across the counter. "Park it in Bay 7. Leave the keys in the drop box." She took the keys, her fingers closing around the worn metal with practiced ease, and turned toward the exit. Behind her, Marcus had already returned to his phone. The parking lot outside was half full. Elena walked to her vehicle. An aging sedan with rust creeping along the wheel wells, and a rear bumper held on with zip ties and determination. She'd driven it for 11 years, kept it running with her own hands, replaced belts and filters in the narrow driveway of her apartment complex, while neighbors walked past without comment. She guided the car into Bay 7, a numbered spot near the far end of the service area, where the pavement cracked into a web of fissures. The bay sat in shadow, away from the main lifts and diagnostic stations, where newer vehicles gleamed under focused work lights. She killed the engine, pocketed the keys, and stepped out. The air smelled of motor oil, brake dust, and the faint sweetness of coolant. It was a scent Elena knew as well as her own skin. A scent that once defined her entire world. Inside, she returned to the waiting area and chose a seat in the corner, away from the television mounted on the wall playing a morning talk show no one watched. She pulled a paperback from her backpack, its cover creased and softened by repeated readings, and settled in. Time passed slowly in waiting rooms. Minutes stretched like taffy, punctuated only by the occasional hiss of an air compressor or the metallic clang of a dropped tool. Elena read without hurry, turning pages with the same calm patience she'd carried through the door. At 9:15, a man in a manager's uniform emerged from the service area, a tablet tucked under one arm. His name tag identified him as Scott. He was in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and the confident stride of someone used to being in charge. He scanned the waiting area, then walked to the counter where Marcus still sat. They spoke in low voices, but the acoustics of the room carried fragments of their conversation. Marcus gestured toward the back lot, toward Bay 7. Scott glanced at his tablet, scrawled, frowned. Their conversation continued for another minute before Scott stepped through the doorway leading to the shop floor. Elena kept reading. The protagonist of her novel was navigating a storm, the prose describing wind and rain with the kind of detail that made you feel the cold. She was 3 paragraphs into a new chapter when Scott returned. This time he walked directly to her. "Ma'am, are you the owner of the vehicle in Bay 7? Elena looked up, marking her place with a finger. "I am." Scott's expression was a carefully managed blend of professional courtesy and thinly veiled frustration. "We've got a bit of a situation with your car." "Situation?" Elena asked gently. He shifted his weight, glancing back toward the service area as if seeking reinforcement. "Your right rear tire's pretty much done. The tread's gone, and there's visible damage to the sidewalls. We can rotate the others, but that one needs to be replaced before we can safely do anything else." Elena nodded slowly. "Okay. Do you have one in stock?" Scott cleared his throat. "We do, but there's another issue. The lug nuts on that wheel are seized, completely rusted. We hit them with the impact wrench, but they won't budge. We're going to need to drill them out, and that's going to take time, probably another 2-3 hours minimum, plus the cost of new hardware." Elena closed her book, set it carefully on the seat beside her. "Can I take a look?" Scott blinked. "Look at what?" "At the wheel." She stood, shouldering her backpack with a fluid motion. Scott's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to amusement, though he tried to hide it. "Ma'am, I appreciate the interest, but this is a pretty technical situation. Our guys know what they're doing." "I'm sure they do," Elena said, her tone unchanged, "but I'd still like to see it." For a moment, Scott seemed to consider refusing. Then he shrugged, a gesture that said he had better things to do but saw no harm in humoring her. "Sure," he said. "Follow me." They walked through the doorway into the service area. The space opened up into a cathedral of automotive repair. High ceilings crisscrossed with ventilation ducts. Lifts raising vehicles into the air like offerings to some mechanical god. The smell intensified here. Richer, layered with the sharp bite of welding and the earthy musk of old gasoline. 3 mechanics worked at different stations. One lay beneath a truck, only his legs visible. Another stood at a diagnostic computer, cables snaking from the machine into the open hood of a crossover. A third, a stocky man in his 30s with grease-stained coveralls, stood near Elena's car. He held an impact wrench in one hand, shaking his head slowly. "That's Derek," Scott said, nodding toward the man. "He's been working on your wheel for the last 20 minutes. Derek looked up as they approached, his face flushed with effort and irritation. "These lug nuts are welded on or something," he said to Scott. "I've never seen anything like it. The rust must have fused them." Elena stepped closer, her eyes moving over the wheel with the kind of focus most people reserve for reading. The tire was indeed worn, the tread pattern nearly smooth. The lug nuts were coated in a thick layer of rust, orange and crumbling. But beneath it, she could see the shape of the fasteners, their edges rounded from repeated attempts to grip them. She knelt down, her movements unhurried, and reached out to touch the nearest lug nut. Her fingers traced the surface lightly, almost tenderly. Derek exchanged a glance with Scott. The unspoken question hung in the air. What is she doing? "Do you have a breaker bar?" Elena asked, still examining the wheel. Derek frowned. "Yeah, but the impact wrench has way more torque than a breaker bar. If the wrench couldn't do it, a bar definitely won't." "Not if you use it wrong," Elena said. She looked up at him then, her gaze steady, unblinking. "But if you understand load distribution and apply force at the correct angle, you can break the rust seal without stripping the fastener." Derek opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced at Scott again, this time with an expression that bordered on disbelief. Scott just shrugged. The universal gesture of, "Let's see where this goes." "Fine," Derek said. He walked to a nearby tool cart, rummaged for a moment, and returned with a long-handled breaker bar and a deep socket. He handed them to Elena without a word. She accepted the tools, tested the weight of the bar, checked the socket for any damage or wear. Then she fitted the socket over the first lug nut, aligned the breaker bar, and paused. Her hands repositioned slightly, adjusting the angle by mere degrees. She placed one foot against the tire for leverage, her body low and balanced. Then she pulled. Not a sudden jerk, but a slow, sustained pressure, the kind of force that built gradually, giving the metal time to respond. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Derek folded his arms, ready to reclaim his tools, and tell her he'd tried that already. Then the lug nut moved. Just a fraction, a microscopic rotation accompanied by a faint cracking sound as the rust seal broke. Elena didn't pause. She adjusted her grip and pulled again. The nut turned another 1/4 inch, then 1/2 inch, then began to spin freely. She removed the socket, moved to the next lug nut, and repeated the process. Same careful alignment, same measured force. The second nut broke free even faster. By the third nut, Derek had stopped folding his arms. He leaned forward slightly. Watching her hands, her positioning, the way she distributed her weight, the fourth nut came off smoothly, and the fifth, the most corroded of all, required only slightly more effort. Elena set the breaker bar down, removed the loosened lug nuts one by one, and pulled the wheel free from the hub. She set it aside gently, then stood and handed the tools back to Derek. "You can drill the studs if you want," she said, brushing her hands against her jeans. "But you might not need to. Just clean the threads and use anti-seize compound when you install the new wheel." Derek stared at her. Scott stared at her. Across the shop, the mechanic who'd been under the truck had rolled out on his creeper, and now sat halfway up, watching. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Scott spoke, his voice quieter than before. "How did you do that?" Elena picked up her backpack from where she'd set it on the floor. "Physics," she said simply. "And practice." She turned to walk back toward the waiting room, but Scott's voice stopped her. "Wait," he said. "Just wait a second." She paused, her back still turned. "Who are you?" Elena turned slowly, her expression unchanged. "A customer," she said. But Scott shook his head. "No. I mean, who are you really? Because what you just did, that's not something you learn from changing a flat on the side of the road." For the first time since entering the shop, something shifted in Elena's demeanor. Not her posture, which remained as calm as still water, not her voice, which stayed soft and even, but something in her eyes, a flicker of old memory, old fire, now banked but never fully extinguished. "I used to work on cars," she said. "Where?" Scott asked. Derek had moved closer now, still holding the breaker bar like he'd forgotten it was in his hand. Elena hesitated, not because she didn't want to answer, but because the answer required context that most people wouldn't believe. "A long time ago," she said finally. "I worked on a racing team." "What kind of racing?" Scott pressed. The quiet kind had become a different kind of quiet now. Not discomfort, but anticipation. The mechanic from under the truck had stood fully and walked over. Marcus had appeared in the doorway from the front office, drawn by the change in atmosphere. Elena looked at each of them in turn. Then she said, very quietly, "I was a mechanic for a team in Europe. Single-seater, open-wheel racing, high-performance vehicles." Derek's eyes widened. "You mean like Formula One?" Elena nodded once. "Yes. Like that." The words hung in the air, impossible and yet utterly convincing in their simplicity. Scott recovered first, his professional instincts kicking in even as his mind tried to process what he'd just heard. "You worked in Formula One. As a mechanic." Elena's gaze remained steady. "For 8 years. I specialized in suspension systems and wheel assembly. That's why I know how to handle seized fasteners. They're not uncommon in high-stress environments, where components are changed multiple times per race weekend. Derek let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Not from amusement, but from sheer disbelief. You're telling me you worked on Formula One cars, and now you're here, driving a 15-year-old sedan with zip ties on the bumper? Elena's expression softened just slightly, the ghost of a smile that never quite formed. Life changes, she said. Priorities shift. I left racing to take care of my mother when she got sick. By the time she passed, the sport had moved on. Teams wanted younger mechanics, people without gaps in their resumes. So I moved on too. The simplicity of her statement carried more weight than any dramatic declaration. Here was a woman who'd once worked at the pinnacle of automotive engineering, who'd stood in pit lanes while machines worth millions screamed past at speeds that defied comprehension, who'd felt the pressure of races won and lost in fractions of seconds, determined by the precision of her work. And now she waited 3 hours in a strip mall auto shop to get her tires rotated. Scott ran a hand through his hair, the gesture of someone trying to recalibrate their understanding of reality. Can you prove it? He asked, then immediately looked embarrassed. I mean, not that I don't believe you, but... Derek cut in. Do you have any pictures? Credentials? Elena reached for her backpack, unzipped a small internal pocket, and withdrew a faded laminated card. She handed it to Scott. It was a team credential. The plastic yellowed with age, the magnetic strip on the back long since demagnetized. The photo showed a younger Elena, her hair dark and pulled back, wearing a team uniform with sponsors' logos across the chest. The text was in multiple languages, but the logo was unmistakable. Scott showed it to Derek, whose face transformed from skepticism to something close to reverence. This is real, Derek breathed. You really did this. Elena took the credential back, returned it to her backpack. I did, she said, and I was good at it, but that was another life. Marcus spoke for the first time since entering the shop floor. Why didn't you say anything? When you brought the car in, why didn't you tell us? Elena looked at him with an expression that was both kind and infinitely tired. Because it doesn't matter, she said. I'm not that person anymore. I'm just someone who needs her car fixed so she can get to work on time tomorrow. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Respectful. Almost sacred. Scott cleared his throat. Miss Reyes, he began, then stopped, reconsidering his words. Elena. Would you be willing to help Derek finish the job? Not because we need the help, but because I think everyone here would benefit from watching you work. She studied his face, searching for mockery or condescension. She found neither. Just genuine respect and curiosity. I have to charge you for my time, she said, a hint of warmth finally entering her voice. Scott smiled. I'll knock the labor cost off your bill. How's that? Fair, Elena said. She set her backpack down again and rolled up her sleeves. What happened over the next 45 minutes would become a story retold in the break room of Martinez Auto Center for years to come. Elena worked with a precision and efficiency that seemed almost choreographed. Every movement was purposeful, economical, the product of thousands of hours spent in environments where seconds mattered and mistakes could cost races or worse. She directed Derek through the process of cleaning the hub, showing him how to identify stress fractures in the metal that most mechanics would miss, pointing out wear patterns that indicated alignment issues the diagnostic computer hadn't caught. She explained torque specifications not as abstract numbers, but as the feel of resistance in your hands, the subtle feedback that told you when metal met metal in exactly the right way. Derek listened with the focus of a student who'd suddenly realized his teacher was a master. The other mechanics drifted over during their breaks, drawn by the quiet authority in Elena's voice and the elegance of her technique. She showed them tricks for dealing with corroded bolts, techniques for reading tire wear that went beyond the standard tread depth measurements, ways to diagnose suspension problems by the sound the wheel made when you spun it by hand. She never raised her voice, never dismissed a question as too basic. She taught the way she worked, with patience and precision and a quiet confidence that needed no performance. Scott watched from a distance, his tablet forgotten in his hands. He saw the way his team transformed in her presence, their usual banter replaced by attentive silence, their movements becoming more deliberate as they unconsciously mimicked her methodical approach. By the time Elena tightened the final lug nut on the new wheel, using the same careful technique she'd demonstrated on the breaker bar, The entire shop had reorganized itself around her. When she stepped back and wiped her hands on a shop towel, Derek cleared his throat. That was incredible, he said, and there was no irony in his voice, only honest admiration. Thank you for showing us. Elena folded the towel carefully and handed it back. You're good mechanics, she said. You just needed to slow down and listen to what the car was telling you. Sometimes we get so focused on the tools and the technology that we forget the basics. Scott approached, his professional demeanor softened by something like awe. Ms. Reyes, I don't even know what to say. You've probably forgotten more about cars than most of us will ever know. I haven't forgotten anything, Elena said quietly. I just don't get to use it very often anymore. He shook his head slowly. That needs to change. Are you working anywhere right now? I mean, doing mechanic work? She smiled. A real smile this time, though it carried a note of sadness. I work at a call center. Technical support for home appliances. It pays the bills. Scott exchanged glances with Derek. With the other mechanics who'd gathered around, an unspoken conversation happened in those looks. The kind of communication that develops between people who work together long enough to know each other's thoughts. Would you be interested in working here? Scott asked. Part-time, full-time, whatever works for your schedule. We could use someone with your expertise. More than that, we could use someone who can teach the way you just did. Elena's expression shifted, surprise breaking through her carefully maintained composure for the first time. You're offering me a job? Not just a job, Scott said. A position, lead technician, if you want it. Training coordinator. Someone who can help us become better at what we do. She looked around the shop, at the faces watching her with a mixture of hope and respect, at the tools and lifts and diagnostic equipment that represented a world she'd thought she'd left behind forever. I don't have any recent references, she said slowly. My last automotive work was over a decade ago. I watched you remove a wheel that had 3 of my mechanics stumped, Scott replied. That's all the reference I need. And honestly, if you can teach half as well as you just demonstrated, you'll transform this entire shop. For a long moment, Elena didn't speak. She was seeing 2 versions of her future. In one, she returned to her small apartment, went back to the call center, spent her days reading from scripts and troubleshooting problems she could solve in her sleep. In the other, she stood in a place that smelled like home, using skills she'd honed to near perfection, passing knowledge to people who genuinely wanted to learn. It wasn't the pit lane, wasn't the electric atmosphere of race day. But it was real, and it was honest, and it was hers if she wanted it. When can I start? She asked. Scott grinned, the tension in the room releasing like a held breath. How about Monday? We open at 7. Elena nodded. I'll be here. The mechanics began to disperse back to their workstations. But the energy in the shop had fundamentally changed. There was a new lightness, a sense that something important had just happened, even if they couldn't quite articulate what it meant. Derek lingered, the breaker bar still in his hand. Can I ask you something? He said to Elena. Of course. What was it like, working in Formula One? Elena considered the question, her eyes distant for a moment. Terrifying, she said finally. Exhilarating. Exhausting in ways I didn't know were possible. Every race felt like standing on the edge of controlled chaos. One mistake, one component failure, and millions of dollars and months of work could disappear in seconds. The pressure was crushing. She paused, then smiled. And it was the most alive I've ever felt. Derek nodded slowly, processing her words. Do you miss it? Every single day, Elena admitted. But missing something and needing it are different things. I made my choice, and I don't regret it. My mother needed me, and I was there for her. That mattered more than any race ever could. Still, Derek said, it must be hard, going from that to, regular life. Elena picked up her backpack, settling it on her shoulders. The weight felt lighter somehow. Every life is worth living with dignity, she said. Working here won't be Formula One, but that doesn't make it less valuable. Maybe more so, in its own way. I can help people here, teach them. That's worth something too. Scott returned with a clipboard, new paperwork for her to complete. As Elena filled out the forms, Marcus approached hesitantly from the doorway. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For how I treated you when you came in. I shouldn't have dismissed you like that. Elena looked up from the paperwork. You didn't know, she said simply. Most people don't. That's why we should never assume, Marcus replied. It's a lesson I apparently needed to learn. She smiled at him, a gesture of forgiveness and understanding. Then we both learned something today. By 11:30, Elena's car was ready. New tire installed, old ones rotated, brakes checked and adjusted. Scott had indeed removed the labor charge and added a complimentary oil change for good measure. As Elena prepared to leave, Derek stopped her one more time. Will you really be here Monday? He asked, a note of uncertainty in his voice as if he feared she might disappear like a dream. I'll be here, Elena assured him. I give you my word. And in a life defined by precision and reliability, Elena's word meant everything. The following Monday, Elena arrived at Martinez Auto Center at 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the shop opened. She wore clean work pants and a plain jacket, her hair still pulled back in the same practical ponytail. Scott met her at the door, a team uniform shirt folded neatly in his hands. It's got your name on it, he said, showing her the embroidered patch above the chest pocket. Elena Reyes, lead technician. She accepted it with both hands, holding it carefully as if it were more precious than fabric and thread. In a way, it was. It represented recognition, restoration, a return to a part of herself she'd thought lost. The first weeks were an adjustment. Elena worked 4 days a week, arriving early and leaving late, her hands quickly remembering rhythms they'd learned long ago. She moved through the shop with quiet authority, never demanding attention, but commanding it anyway through the quality of her work and the depth of her knowledge. Derek became her shadow, asking questions and absorbing answers with hungry focus. The other mechanics began consulting her on difficult repairs, at first hesitantly, then with growing confidence in her abilities. Scott watched his team's skills improve measurably, saw customer satisfaction ratings climb, noticed how problems that used to take hours now resolved in minutes under Elena's guidance. But the transformation went deeper than metrics. The shop's culture shifted. The casual dismissiveness that had characterized Marcus's initial interaction with Elena evaporated, replaced by a baseline of respect for every customer who walked through the door. When a young woman brought in her car and mentioned she'd tried to fix the problem herself first, Derek listened carefully to her description instead of talking over her. When an elderly man seemed confused by the estimate, Elena sat with him and explained each line item until he understood exactly what was being done and why. Word spread. Customers who'd been coming to Martinez for years noticed the change and told their friends. New clients arrived asking specifically for the woman who used to work on race cars. Local automotive forums buzzed with stories about the mechanic, who could diagnose problems other shops missed, who took time to educate rather than just repair, who treated every vehicle with the same care she'd once given million-dollar racing machines. 3 months after Elena started, a reporter from the local newspaper arrived asking for an interview. Scott had contacted them, wanting to share Elena's story, but only after getting her permission. She was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with attention, but Scott convinced her that her experience could inspire others. The article ran on a Sunday morning, front page of the local section. From Formula One to Main Street, former racing mechanic finds new purpose. It told Elena's story with respect and nuance, avoiding sensationalism, focusing instead on themes of adaptation, humility, and the value of expertise at any level. A photograph showed her in the shop, kneeling beside a wheel, her hands demonstrating proper technique to Derek, while other mechanics watched. Her expression was focused, patient, alive, with purpose. The article mentioned her mother, her years away from the industry, her choice to prioritize family over career. It quoted Scott praising her teaching abilities and Derek describing how she'd transformed his approach to his work. And it ended with Elena's own words. People think there's a hierarchy in automotive work, that racing is somehow more important than everyday repairs. But every car matters to the person who depends on it. Every repair done right keeps someone safe, gets them to work, helps them pick up their kids from school. That's not less meaningful than racing. It's differently meaningful. And right now, this is exactly where I want to be. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The shop's phone rang constantly, with people wanting to book appointments. Automotive technical schools called, asking if Elena would speak to students. Other racing enthusiasts reached out wanting to share memories of the years she'd worked in the sport. Several former colleagues from her racing days contacted her through social media, surprised and delighted to discover what had become of her. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 2 weeks after the article published, a young woman in her early 20s arrived at the shop asking for Elena. Her name was Sophia, and she carried a worn backpack and an air of determined nervousness. She waited until Elena's lunch break, then approached with rehearsed courage. "Miss Reyes," she began, "I read about you in the paper. I'm a student at the Technical College, Automotive Engineering program. I'm the only woman in most of my classes." Elena set down her sandwich and gave Sophia her full attention. "How are they treating you?" "Like I don't belong," Sophia admitted. "Some of the guys are fine, but others make it clear they think I'm wasting everyone's time. The instructors don't say it directly, but I can tell they're skeptical. I'm starting to wonder if they're right." Elena let the silence sit for a moment, then spoke with the same quiet certainty she brought to every task. "They're not right. They're afraid." "Afraid?" Sophia asked, confused. Elena nodded. "When someone challenges our assumptions about who belongs in a space, it threatens our sense of certainty. It's easier to exclude than to expand. The men who dismiss you are protecting their own insecurity, not identifying your limitations." "But how do you deal with it?" Sophia asked. "How do you keep going when everyone's waiting for you to fail?" "You don't perform for their expectations," Elena said. "You focus on the work. You learn everything you can. You make yourself undeniable not through arguments but through competence. And you remember that their doubt is not your burden to carry." Sophia's eyes glistened. "I saw what you did," she said, "going from Formula One to here. Not letting the past define you. Making something new matter just as much. I needed to know it was possible." Elena reached across the small table and placed her hand over Sophia's. "It's not just possible," she said. "It's necessary. The world needs more people like you, people who refuse to accept the limitations others try to impose. Stay in your program, finish it, then come back here. I'll make sure you have a place to work when you graduate." Sophia's tears spilled over then, relief and gratitude, and hope mingling in equal measure. "Thank you," she whispered. Elena smiled. "Thank you for reminding me why this matters." Sophia visited the shop regularly after that, spending her free afternoons watching Elena work, asking questions, learning techniques that textbooks couldn't teach. She became part of the shop's extended family, another person transformed by Elena's quiet revolution. As spring turned to summer, Martinez Auto Center became known as more than just a repair shop. It became a teaching facility, a place where knowledge was valued and shared freely, where excellence was pursued not for glory but for its own sake. Scott promoted Elena to shop manager, a role she initially resisted, until he convinced her that leadership was just another form of teaching. The shop hired 2 more mechanics, both young, both hungry to learn. One was Sophia, who graduated top of her class and accepted Elena's job offer before the ink on her diploma dried. The other was a recent immigrant who'd worked on vehicles his entire life but lacked formal certification. Elena saw his potential immediately and convinced Scott to take a chance. Both thrived under her mentorship. Derek, meanwhile, had transformed. The cocky uncertainty of their first meeting had given way to confident humility. He studied constantly, asked better questions, developed an intuition for diagnosis that impressed even Elena. When he earned his master technician certification, he credited Elena in his acceptance speech at the ceremony. She attended in her shop uniform, sitting in the back, uncomfortable with recognition but deeply proud. 1 year after the day she'd knelt down to remove that seized wheel, the shop held a small celebration. Cake in the break room, awkward speeches from people unaccustomed to sentiment, genuine affection awkwardly expressed through mechanic humor and shared stories. Scott presented Elena with a plaque. Nothing fancy, just brass on wood with simple engraving. "Elena Reyes, lead technician, teacher, the person who showed us what mastery looks like. Elena accepted it with the same grace she brought to every moment, thanking them briefly and deflecting attention back to the team's collective growth. But later, alone in her small apartment, she hung the plaque on the wall beside her old team credential from her racing days. 2 chapters of one life. Different, but equally valued. She sat on her second-hand couch, a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, and felt something she hadn't experienced in the years since leaving racing. Not the adrenaline rush of competition, not the sharp focus of high-stakes performance, but something deeper and more sustainable. Contentment. Purpose. The quiet satisfaction of work done well and knowledge shared freely. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sophia, asking a technical question about differential diagnosis. Elena smiled and began typing her response, her fingers moving with the same precision they brought to every task. Outside, the city settled into evening. Cars passed on the street below, each one carrying someone to somewhere important. And in a modest shop across town, her tools waited in their organized rows, ready for another day of transformation disguised as ordinary repair work. If this story moved you, take a moment to consider the people in your life who carry extraordinary stories beneath ordinary appearances. The checkout clerk who speaks 4 languages. The janitor who once taught university courses. The quiet neighbor who changed industries to care for family. Expertise doesn't disappear when circumstances change. It waits, patient and ready, for the moment when it can serve again. Share this story with someone who needs reminding that every chapter matters, that starting over isn't starting from zero, and that the most profound impact often happens in the quietest spaces. Subscribe for more stories, where dignity triumphs over dismissal, where skill speaks louder than status, and where the journey from extraordinary to ordinary and back again reveals the truth that both have always been the same thing.